Click on the subscribe button on the screen and check out our channel for more videos like this. It was supposed to be an ordinary weekend. Tom had left early for his business trip. The house was quiet, and I had planned to catch up on some reading or maybe organize a few things I'd been putting off. But as the hours passed, I couldn't seem to focus. The house felt too big and too quiet without him. I found myself thinking more and more about Jason, my stepson. He'd been home for a few months now, trying to get his life together after college, and though we were always polite with each other, something about our interactions had changed lately. He wasn't the same kid who'd reluctantly moved in after his father and I got married. He was grown now, a man, and I couldn't deny I'd noticed it. I didn't mean to feel this way. I loved Tom, but Jason had a way of getting under my skin without even realizing it. It was innocent at first. Long talks in the kitchen when Tom was out, joking around, sharing meals. But the way Jason looked at me lately, it made me feel things I hadn't felt in a long time, and I hated myself for it. That Saturday, I came downstairs to find Jason lounging on the couch, flipping through channels like he didn't have a care in the world. I watched him for a moment before he noticed me, feeling a strange tightness in my chest. I wasn't sure what it was, but I knew I had to keep it in check. "Bored?" I asked, sitting beside him. He moved over, making space for me, and I could feel his eyes on me as I settled in. "A little," he said with that boyish smile I knew so well. "It's too quiet in here." I nodded, trying to focus on the TV, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting between us. His leg brushed mine as he moved, and it sent a small jolt through me. It wasn't the first time I'd noticed how close we were lately, but today it felt different, more intense. The silence between us stretched out longer than usual, and when I suggested we watch a movie, it was more to distract myself than anything else. I went to the kitchen to grab us some wine, hoping it might help calm my nerves. When I came back, I handed Jason a glass, our fingers brushing lightly as I did. I tried to ignore how it made my heart race. This was ridiculous. I was overthinking things. Jason was my stepson. Whatever I was feeling was just a weird reaction to the quiet house, or maybe to Tom being away. But as the movie played, I couldn't concentrate. Jason was sitting closer than he usually did, and I couldn't help but notice the way he filled out the space next to me. His presence was magnetic in a way I wasn't prepared for. I could feel the warmth of him, the subtle tension growing between us, and no matter how much I tried to push it away, it lingered. I shifted slightly on the couch, aware of how close my hand was to his on the armrest. My mind was a blur of thoughts I didn't want to have, thoughts I'd been ignoring for weeks. This wasn't right. But when I looked at Jason, really looked at him, the line between what was right and what wasn't began to blur. As the movie dragged on, I barely registered the scenes on the screen. My focus was elsewhere, on the man sitting beside me, on how close we were, and how wrong it all felt, yet I couldn't stop it. I kept telling myself it was harmless, that we were just spending time together like we always did. But the way Jason's body brushed against mine, the way our arms kept almost touching, it was anything but harmless. I could feel the tension thick in the air between us, the kind that builds slowly, creeping up on you until you can't ignore it anymore. I wanted to say something, to break the silence that hung heavy between us, but my throat was dry, and I wasn't sure what words would even come out. I glanced at him again, and this time he looked back. Our eyes met, and for a split second I saw something in his gaze that mirrored what I was feeling. Confusion, maybe. Curiosity. It was fleeting, but it was enough to make my heart pound. Without thinking, I shifted slightly, closing the already tiny gap between us. I told myself I was just trying to get comfortable, but I knew better. I could feel his warmth, the barest hint of his breath against my skin, and suddenly I was more aware of Jason than I'd ever been before. Every part of me was screaming that I should stop, that I should get up, make an excuse, and leave the room, but I couldn't. I didn't want to. I had always thought of Jason as Tom's son, as a boy I had helped raise, but now, sitting next to him, I realized just how much that dynamic had shifted. He wasn't the same awkward teenager I'd known all those years ago. He was a man now, with broad shoulders and a quiet confidence that had sneaked up on me, and somehow I hadn't noticed until it was too late. The glass of wine I'd been sipping was now empty, but I kept holding on to it, more for something to do with my hands than anything else. Jason was so close now. I could almost feel the weight of his arm against mine. I glanced down, seeing how close our fingers were, and I could feel my pulse quicken. His hand shifted almost imperceptibly, but I noticed. It was subtle, just a slight movement, but enough that our fingers nearly touched. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I wondered if he felt it too, this strange pull between us. I didn't know what to do, how to respond, and my mind raced with conflicting thoughts. I told myself again that I should get up, that I should put an end to whatever this was, but my body refused to move. My heart was pounding, my skin warm, and all I could think about was how easy it would be to let my hand slip just a little bit closer, just enough to feel his fingers against mine. But I didn't. I couldn't. This was wrong, and I knew it. Tom was Jason's father, and I loved him. But sitting there in that moment with Jason so close, I felt like I was standing on the edge of something dangerous. And part of me wanted to step over the line. I shifted again, trying to put a little distance between us, but it was like trying to push back against a current that was too strong. The tension between us was undeniable now, and I wasn't sure if I could keep pretending that nothing was happening. The room felt warmer than before, like the air itself had thickened. I could feel my pulse in my throat, and every second stretched out painfully slow, the weight of what could happen pressing down on me. Jason hadn't moved, but I could feel his presence, closer than ever, and it felt like he was waiting for something, for me to make the first move, to do something, anything, but I didn't. I couldn't let myself go that far. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but the feeling wouldn't go away. My mind was racing, full of what-ifs and maybes, and I hated that I was even entertaining them. This wasn't me. I wasn't the kind of woman who crossed lines, who blurred boundaries. I loved Tom. He was a good man, and we'd built a life together, one I wasn't willing to throw away. But here I was, sitting beside his son, caught up in feelings I didn't understand. Lisa. Jason's voice was low, almost hesitant. My name on his lips sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't look at him, couldn't bring myself to meet his eyes because I knew if I did, everything would spill out. "Yeah?" I said, my voice quieter than I intended. He didn't say anything for a moment, and the silence that followed felt heavy, almost suffocating. I could feel the tension coiling tighter between us, drawing us together in a way that felt inevitable. I wanted to stop it, to pull away, but I was frozen in place. I didn't trust myself to move. I should probably go upstairs," Jason finally said, his voice thick with something unspoken. Relief washed over me, but it was tinged with disappointment, and I hated that I felt it. This should have been a clear moment of escape, but instead it felt like I was teetering on the edge, unsure of what I wanted. "Yeah," I echoed, nodding even though I wasn't sure he could see me. "That's a good idea." He stood up slowly, and I felt the absence of him immediately. The space between us felt colder, the tension loosening but not disappearing. As he moved toward the stairs, I stayed seated, clutching the empty wine glass like it was an anchor to reality. I didn't not look up until I heard him pause at the base of the stairs. I could feel his eyes on me, lingering, and I could sense the hesitation in the air, like he was still debating something in his head. I wanted to tell him to just go, to break whatever this was between us before it spiraled out of control. But when I finally looked up, our eyes locked, and that pull was still there, stronger than ever. He opened his mouth to say something, but the words never came. Instead, he just shook his head slightly, a small, sad smile on his lips, before turning and disappearing up the stairs. As soon as he was out of sight, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. My hands were trembling, and I could feel my heart still racing, my mind spinning with everything that had almost happened. I sat there for what felt like hours, replaying the moment in my head, trying to make sense of it all. What was I doing? How had I let it get this far? I knew things couldn't continue like this. Whatever had almost happened between Jason and me, it needed to stop. I couldn't let it grow into something I'd regret for the rest of my life. I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of the day pressing down on me, and I headed upstairs, pausing briefly outside Jason's door. I thought about knocking, about saying something to make it all go away, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Instead, I walked to my bedroom, crawled under the covers, and lay there in the dark, trying to quiet my thoughts. It wasn't just Jason. It was me, too. Something had shifted, and I didn't know how to shift it back. Like, share, comment, and click on the subscribe button on the screen to subscribe to our channel for more real and true stories like this. I remember when I first saw him. I'd just started my shift on the ward, and as usual, I was trying to shake off the early morning grogginess that clings no matter how much coffee I drink. He was sitting up in his hospital bed, flipping through a magazine, but he looked up as I walked in, and for a moment, our eyes met. I didn't think much of it at first. He was a patient, just like any other, and I had a routine to follow. But something about the way he looked at me, with those warm, tired eyes, made me pause. "Mr. Carson," I said, confirming his name as I looked over his chart. He smiled, a slow, relaxed smile that made him look far too comfortable for someone in a hospital gown. "That's me," he replied, his voice soft but with a hint of humor. I could see a wedding band on his finger, glinting in the light, but somehow that detail barely registered. My job was to keep things professional, but there was something disarming about him, something that made me linger just a bit longer than I should have. I went through the usual checks, asking questions and listening to his responses, but my mind was oddly focused on his presence, on the ease with which he spoke to me. When I made a note in his chart, I could feel his gaze on me, as if he was studying me in the same way I was studying him. It felt strange, this awareness that was growing between us. I told myself it was nothing, that I'd probably imagined it, but the feeling stayed with me long after I left his room. Over the next few days, our paths crossed more often than I'd anticipated. I was assigned to his care, which meant checking in on him regularly. Each time we'd exchange a few words, a bit more than was necessary. He was polite, friendly, and every conversation felt like peeling back a layer, getting to know a little more of the person beneath the patient. It was subtle, this connection, but it grew in quiet moments when I'd catch him watching me from his bed, a soft smile playing on his lips. One evening I stayed a little later than usual, catching up on paperwork, and I noticed his light still on. The ward was quiet, most of the patients asleep or resting, and I don't know what possessed me, but I found myself drifting toward his room, as if on autopilot. He looked up, surprised, when I entered, but his expression softened, and he sat up a little straighter. Couldn't sleep? I asked, leaning against the door frame, my voice low so as not to disturb anyone else. He shook his head, smiling that same calm, gentle smile. Too many thoughts, he admitted, and there was something in his tone that felt unguarded, open in a way that surprised me. I shouldn't have stayed. I should have just wished him a good night and gone back to my work. But something in his gaze held me there. It was quiet between us, but the silence felt different, charged with something unspoken. I could feel my heart beating a little faster, a warmth spreading through me that had nothing to do with the hospital's heating. "I understand," I replied softly, and we just looked at each other, neither of us moving, neither of us breaking the silence. I told myself it was harmless, that I was just being kind to a patient who seemed a little lonely, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the whole truth. The next morning, I felt that strange pull even more, almost as if something had shifted overnight. I'd spent the better part of the evening replaying our conversation, that quiet exchange that seemed to mean more than it should have. I'd told myself it was nothing, just the way hospital walls make things feel more intimate, the way a late night can blur lines. But when I saw him again, waiting with that soft, expectant look, I knew it wasn't just in my head. I approached his bed with my usual clipboard, but everything felt different. My heart pounded in my chest, and I was so aware of every small movement, every glance. He watched me closely, a slow smile breaking across his face as I asked him how he was feeling. "Better now," he said, his eyes locked on mine, his voice carrying that same unspoken warmth I'd felt the night before. It felt like an invitation, like he was testing the waters, seeing if I felt it too. My cheeks felt warm, and I found myself fidgeting with the pen in my hand, focusing on my chart to avoid his gaze. "Glad to hear it," I replied, trying to sound casual, but my voice came out softer than I'd intended. I knew I should have pulled back, should have stayed strictly professional, but it was like there was a magnet between us, drawing us closer, pulling me in. He reached up, as if to stretch, and his hand brushed against mine for just a moment. It was brief, barely a second, but I could feel the warmth of his skin, the slight pressure of his touch. My heart skipped a beat, and I pulled my hand back quickly, trying to ignore the way my pulse had quickened. "I'm sorry," he said softly, but he didn't look away. There was no real apology in his tone, only that same quiet curiosity, that openness I'd seen before. He was searching my face, watching my reaction, and I knew he felt it too, this strange, undeniable tension that had crept up between us. It's okay," I managed, feeling flustered in a way that was entirely new to me. I was a nurse. I'd spent years learning to keep my emotions in check, to stay calm and composed no matter the situation. But here, with him, it was different. Every look, every touch felt heightened, like we were dancing on the edge of something we couldn't fully control. I tried to keep my voice steady as I continued with his checkup, but I could feel his eyes on me, watching every movement. And I didn't mind. In fact, a part of me liked it, liked the way he looked at me, as if I were the only person in the room. The way he watched me felt intimate, and I found myself lingering, allowing the silence between us to stretch. "Thank you," he said suddenly, breaking the quiet, his voice low and sincere. I looked at him, surprised, and he smiled, that same warm, familiar smile that made me feel like we'd known each other far longer than a few days. "For what?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Well, for being here, I guess." He hesitated, glancing down at his hands before looking back up at me. "You make this whole hospital thing a lot easier. It's nice having someone to talk to." I swallowed, feeling a lump in my throat that I couldn't quite explain. "I'm just doing my job," I replied. But we both knew it was more than that. I hadn't felt this kind of connection with anyone in a long time, and it scared me. I wanted to step back, to protect myself, but I couldn't bring myself to move. For a moment, we just looked at each other, caught in the silence, the weight of everything we weren't saying filling the room. I could feel the warmth of his presence, the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing, and it felt like I was standing on the edge of something dangerous. But I didn't want to step back. As I turned to leave, his hand reached out again, catching my wrist gently. It wasn't forceful, just enough to make me pause, to make me look back at him. His fingers were warm against my skin, and I could feel my pulse quicken, the room suddenly feeling smaller, more confined. "Stay," he whispered, his voice barely audible, but it sent a shiver down my spine. I knew I should pull away, should step back and break whatever was happening between us, but I was frozen, caught between what I knew was right and what I felt. For a second, I stayed there, feeling the heat of his touch, the softness in his gaze. It would have been so easy to stay, to let myself get lost in this feeling, to pretend that nothing else mattered, but I couldn't. I pulled my hand away slowly, feeling the loss of his warmth immediately, and I forced a smile, trying to mask the turmoil I felt inside. "I can't," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, understanding, but the look in his eyes was one of quiet regret, of something unfinished. And as I turned and left his room, my heart heavy, I knew that this wasn't over, that whatever was building between us had only just begun. I tried to keep my distance over the next few days, convincing myself that if I kept busy, if I focused on the other patients, maybe this feeling would go away. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop thinking about him. Every time I walked by his room, I'd catch myself glancing inside, hoping he wasn't looking back, yet secretly hoping he would. And when our eyes did meet, there was always that same silent understanding, that pull that seemed impossible to ignore. One evening, as I was finishing my rounds, I saw him sitting on the edge of his bed, his head down, his hands clasped tightly. He looked up when I entered, his expression softer than I'd ever seen it, almost vulnerable. I could feel that familiar warmth rising in my chest, the same nervous excitement I'd felt every time I'd been near him. I hesitated in the doorway, but he didn't look away. Instead, he offered a small smile, and something about the way he looked at me felt like a plea, like he was reaching out in some silent way. I knew I should walk away, just turn around and leave, but my feet moved on their own, bringing me closer until I was standing right in front of him. "Long day?" he asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper, and I could hear the weight behind his words, the way he was struggling to keep his emotions in check. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, not wanting to break whatever spell seemed to hang between us. The room felt smaller, more intimate, and I was so aware of every small detail, the sound of his breathing, the faint scent of his cologne, the warmth radiating from him. Without thinking, I sat down beside him on the edge of the bed. He didn't move, didn't say anything, just sat there quietly, our shoulders almost touching. I felt the tension in the air, the way every second seemed to drag out, every breath heavy with the weight of everything we couldn't say. After a while, he looked over at me, his eyes filled with that same unspoken longing, that quiet yearning I'd felt since the beginning. He reached out, his hand hovering just above mine, as if he were afraid to cross that final line. I knew I should have pulled back, should have created that distance, but I didn't. I let him take my hand, felt the warmth of his skin against mine, and it was like something finally settled inside me. He looked down at our intertwined fingers, his thumb tracing gentle patterns along my knuckles, and for a moment, it was as if nothing else existed. No rules, no barriers, just the quiet connection we'd been dancing around for so long. I could feel the depth of his emotions in that single touch, the longing that mirrored my own, and it was both comforting and terrifying. "We shouldn't," I whispered, my voice shaky, but he shook his head, his gaze soft but intense. "I know," he replied, his voice barely audible, and there was a sadness in his eyes, a quiet acceptance that somehow made everything feel even more real. But I couldn't help it. Being around you, it feels like I've known you forever. I swallowed, feeling a lump in my throat as his words settled over me, each one resonating with a truth I hadn't wanted to admit. I felt it too, that strange, unexplainable familiarity, that feeling of comfort and ease that only seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. We stayed there like that for a long time, our hands still intertwined, the silence thick with everything we wanted to say but couldn't. I could feel the intensity of his emotions, the way he looked at me like I was something precious, something he didn't want to lose. And in that moment, I realized that maybe he was feeling just as lost as I was, just as afraid of what this meant, of what we could become. Eventually, I pulled my hand back, feeling the loss of his touch almost immediately, and I forced myself to stand up, to put that distance back between us. He looked at me, his expression filled with quiet regret, and I could see the struggle in his eyes, the same struggle that had been tearing me apart. "I'm sorry," he said softly, his voice filled with a sadness that made my heart ache. "I didn't mean to make things difficult for you." I shook my head, offering him a small, bittersweet smile. "It's not your fault," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "Some things just happen." We both knew that whatever had passed between us would remain unspoken, a memory we'd carry quietly, something beautiful and unfinished. As I turned to leave, I felt a strange sense of peace, a bittersweet acceptance that sometimes the things that matter most are the ones we have to let go. And as I walked down the hall, my heart heavy yet oddly light, I realized that maybe, in some strange way, that quiet connection would stay with me forever, a reminder of something precious, something that almost was. I hadn't thought twice about Mark staying with us. He was family, after all, and it made sense when my husband suggested he crash here for the weekend instead of paying for a hotel. Mark had recently taken a job in the city, and until he settled in, he'd been bouncing between friends' places and short-term rentals. I didn't mind at all. Mark was fun, easygoing, and he blended seamlessly into our lives, but the timing turned out to be a little strange. My husband got called out of town for a work emergency right after Mark arrived, leaving just the two of us in the house. "You'll be fine," my husband had said as he packed his bag. "Mark will keep you company." The first night passed in a blur of takeout and casual conversation. Mark had always been charming in a relaxed, effortless way, and I found myself laughing more than I had in a while. We stayed up later than I'd planned, sharing stories and sipping wine in the living room, the house filled with a warm, comfortable silence whenever we paused. I told myself it was just nice to have some company, but there was something else, a kind of undercurrent in the air that felt different. I pushed the feeling aside, thinking I was just tired, but the next day it was still there, lingering in the glances we exchanged, and in the subtle way Mark's hand would brush mine when he passed me something. It was almost imperceptible, easy to ignore if I chose to, but it made my heart beat a little faster every time. I had no reason to feel this way, no reason at all. Mark was my husband's cousin, someone I'd known for years, but something about being alone together, just the two of us, brought a kind of awareness that I didn't want to admit. I told myself it was nothing, just a reaction to the quiet house, the sudden change in plans. But when Mark looked at me, there was something in his eyes that made me question everything. The next morning I woke up with a strange sense of anticipation, a subtle awareness that I wasn't alone in the house. I could hear Mark in the kitchen, the clinking of cups and the smell of coffee wafting through the hallway. I quickly got dressed and joined him, trying to brush off the nervous energy I felt. When I walked in, he looked up and gave me an easy smile, handing me a mug of coffee. "Thought you could use this," he said, his voice warm and familiar. I took the mug, feeling the warmth of his fingers lingering against mine for a moment longer than necessary. "Thanks," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. We moved to the dining table, and he began telling me about his job, his new life in the city, and the frustrations of navigating it all. It felt natural, the way we fell into conversation, but beneath it all, I could feel that strange energy still there, like a current humming just beneath the surface. At one point, he leaned forward, resting his hand close to mine on the table, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. His presence seemed larger than life in the quiet of the house, each glance and every small gesture carrying an unintended weight. We'd been talking for nearly an hour, but it felt like minutes. When I got up to clear our mugs, he followed me to the sink. We stood side by side, our arms brushing as we worked, and I was painfully aware of how close we were. I could feel his eyes on me as I turned to set the dishes aside, and when I finally looked up, our faces were closer than I'd realized. I could see the faint stubble along his jaw, the hint of a smile that played at the corner of his lips. I took a step back, breaking the spell, and forced a laugh, trying to shake off the tension. "We should probably find something to do, or we'll end up drinking coffee all day," I said, hoping it would lighten the moment. He agreed, and we decided to take a walk around the neighborhood, a neutral, harmless way to fill the day. Outside, the air was cool, and we fell into a comfortable rhythm as we walked. The tension between us eased a little, but it wasn't gone entirely. We talked about anything and everything, from our favorite music to the small frustrations of life, sharing things we'd never really discussed before. I felt myself relaxing, letting my guard down, and there were moments when we'd laugh or share a look that felt just a bit too meaningful. At one point, as we paused near a small park, Mark turned to me, his expression more serious than before. "You know, it's been really nice being here. I didn't expect it to feel so easy." His voice was soft, and I could feel my cheeks flush under his gaze. "I feel the same," I replied quietly, feeling a mixture of guilt and excitement that I couldn't quite shake. Standing there, with the world moving around us, it felt as if we were in our own bubble, a place where consequences didn't exist. After the walk, we spent the rest of the afternoon around the house, cooking together and laughing about silly things. There was an ease between us that felt new, a kind of intimacy that didn't belong. By the time evening rolled around, I was acutely aware of how the day had changed something between us. Every shared look, every casual touch felt deliberate, like we were moving toward a line neither of us wanted to cross but couldn't seem to avoid. As we sat down for dinner, I felt the weight of everything that had gone unsaid hanging in the air. The candlelight cast a warm glow across the table, and I caught myself watching him more than I should have, noticing the way his eyes would linger on me just a second too long. I was torn between wanting to say something to break the tension and wanting to let it grow, curious, to see where it might lead. When the meal was over, I cleared the dishes and found myself standing by the sink, lost in thought. Suddenly, Mark was beside me again, reaching past me to grab a glass from the shelf. The closeness was dizzying, and I felt my heart pound as he leaned in, his arm brushing against mine. "Thanks for everything today," he murmured, his voice low and close to my ear. I could feel the warmth of his breath, and for a brief moment, I didn't move, didn't breathe, caught in the magnetic pull of his presence. I turned slightly, our faces just inches apart, and for a heartbeat, it felt like everything else faded away. But before I could say anything, he straightened, giving me a small, almost knowing smile before stepping back, leaving me standing there, my mind racing with thoughts I didn't want to admit. That night, I lay awake for hours, my mind replaying every small moment between us. Every glance, every laugh, every brush of his hand lingered in my memory, making it impossible to relax. I kept trying to reason with myself, to push the feelings away, but they only grew more vivid in the quiet darkness. The next morning, I almost expected him to act differently, for something to be strained between us, but he was as calm and friendly as ever, falling into our usual banter over breakfast, and it was almost enough to convince me that maybe, just maybe, I'd imagined the whole thing. We kept busy, filling the day with errands and light conversation, as if to avoid giving ourselves any time alone with our thoughts. But by the time evening rolled around, the easy distractions faded, and the tension returned, creeping into the silences between us. When the sun dipped below the horizon, and the house filled with the soft glow of the lamps, I could feel the shift again. We were sitting in the living room, each of us on opposite ends of the couch, but it felt like an invisible thread was pulling us closer. Mark leaned forward, elbows on his knees, watching me with an intensity that made my heart race. I felt myself mirroring him, leaning closer without meaning to, until we were sitting only inches apart. His gaze flicked down to my hand resting on the couch, and for a moment I thought he might reach for it. I could feel the warmth radiating from him, and it felt like the room had shrunk, closing us into this small, charged space. "I don't think I've ever felt this way," he murmured, almost to himself. His voice was soft, filled with something vulnerable and raw, and the way he looked at me made it clear he wasn't talking about anything casual. I felt my throat tighten, and I struggled to find words. "Mark, we shouldn't," I whispered, even as my heart seemed to beat in time with his, caught in that same undeniable rhythm. "I know," he said, and for a moment the spell seemed to break. He leaned back, rubbing a hand over his face as if he were trying to shake himself free. "It's just this weekend, being here. It's felt different, more real than anything else." I knew exactly what he meant, because I'd felt it too. That strange, unexpected closeness that had grown between us, something I hadn't asked for but couldn't ignore. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the same one tearing at me. And for a split second I thought about closing the distance, letting the pull between us finally win. But I knew if I did, there'd be no going back. Instead, I took a deep, shaky breath, forcing myself to stand. "I think we both need some space," I said, barely able to meet his eyes. Before something happens that we can't take back." He didn't argue. He just nodded, looking at me with an expression that held both regret and understanding. There was a heaviness in the air as I walked out of the room, and I felt his eyes on me the entire way. Once I was out of sight, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, my hands shaking as I tried to process everything. That night, I stayed in my room, keeping the door closed and lying awake, feeling the weight of everything we'd almost let ourselves fall into. It was like standing on the edge of a cliff, feeling the urge to jump, but knowing the fall would change everything. In the morning, Mark was already gone, leaving behind a note on the counter, thanking me for the weekend and wishing me the best. The message was simple, polite, like nothing unusual had happened, but I could sense the finality in it. It was as if he'd realized, just as I had, that this was something we couldn't let go further, something we both needed to walk away from while we still could. I stood there for a long time, reading and rereading his words, feeling a mix of relief and loss that I didn't quite know what to do with. The weekend was over, and life would go back to normal. But deep down, I knew that some part of me would always remember the way it had felt to almost cross that line, the tension that had woven itself into those quiet moments between us. It was something I'd carry with me, a secret memory that would fade over time, but never disappear entirely. And maybe that was for the best, leaving it as an almost, something that had come close but never quite touched, a feeling just on the edge of reality. Click on the subscribe button on the screen to subscribe to our channel for more real and true stories like this.